If our speaker is ready, so please come up to the stage. Mr. Edwin Lau, Mr. Natta Pachayut, and Erna Irawati.
All right, well, I'll get started. You've already been hearing a lot about the government at a glance over the course of the day, so I will try not to be too repetitive, but I do need the clicker. Is there the clicker for the presentation? Oh, there. Thank you. So I think that in terms of the case for why the data in the Southeast Asian government at a glance supports the ASEAN vision of a citizen-centric civil service, I think that Shinwei and my director, Mr. Banturi, have already made that case. I just wanted to emphasize a few of the points in how we interpret the data. And then also, as has come out in the conversation, this has really been a dialogue. And what we've been seeking to do is to have an ASEAN-centric conversation. And in fact, this has been extremely useful for us to get outside of the traditional group of OECD countries. We often call ourselves the group of like-minded countries. But in order to understand what you believe in, it's very useful to look more broadly to see what are the similarities and what are the differences when you start looking beyond that group of like-minded countries. And we've learned a lot. So as Mr. Banturi mentioned, we've been producing the government at a glance every 2 years since 2009. Since 2014, we began to look at Latin America, and we've been producing every 2 years a Latin American government at a glance, and now we've begun the work on the Southeast Asian government at a glance. And what we've seen is as we look across a variety of levels of maturity, of different visions, even within ASEAN itself, it's incredible the amount of diversity that we see within ASEAN countries. But that's also been a very good source of learning. So the objectives of the Southeast Asian government at a glance was to provide evidence, as my director mentioned, to compare across these different country contexts, to look at the processes and performance, not just the overall outcomes. Outcomes are important, and it's always important to keep the outcomes in mind, to look at where it is that you want to head. But the outcomes in and of themselves, they don't tell you how to get there. They don't explain to you the processes. And so oftentimes, especially when you go to international conferences and you listen to the different speakers, they make it sound so easy. You know, you just take our program and you implement it, and then you'll have citizen-centric government. It's like an infomercial. But it's never easy. We know that. So understanding what are the enablers that support these reforms is perhaps not so sexy, you know, in terms of talking to your minister. But it's important for you as practitioners to be able to understand what steps need to be taken. It's about improving your public governance. So Shinwei talked about whole of government. We're also talking about how all of these reforms interact together. So the sequencing of the reforms, it's important to have digitization, but you need the competencies to support it. You need to have the flexibility in your public human resource management system. You need to have that orientation. So all of these things come together. I could add to that list regulatory reform, budget flexibility, centers of government. All of this is part of a whole. So we have to start thinking about how they interact with one another in order to achieve the outcomes. And all of that ultimately is what we're trying to do to have a more citizen-centric civil service. So the contents we've talked about already: public finance, public employment, budgeting. We didn't go so much into detail in the budgeting issues, but actually the OECD has a network of budget directors of ministries of finance that meets once a year in Thailand. And that group is the group that helped us to collect the information on budget processes and procedures between the OECD and also the World Bank PEMNA network. Together, we were able to collect this information. The human resource management, the digital that we collected with all of you, and then finally outcome measures, which we've collected from a variety of international sources. In terms of context, just as I had mentioned in the earlier session, your civil services are small, and the size of your government is very small as well relative to the OECD. This is not necessarily a bad thing. And I think one of the biggest dangers are when people simply look at the overall percentage of GDP that's spent within OECD countries and they say, we have to get there. It's probably not a good idea, or at least you need to think about what the composition of that expenditure is. Much of the composition and a growing percentage of the composition of public expenditure in OECD countries is are transfers, income transfers to individuals, either for social security or health benefits or family benefits. And this part is actually the part that citizens like, but it's out of the control of budget offices for the most part. These are what we call entitlement expenditures, and they're growing. And they're growing to a point where, in many cases, they're unsustainable. So before you start looking at how you compare with OECD countries, it's also important to understand what the breakdown of those expenditures are. We see a wide variation in the fiscal situation, and this is looking at the fiscal balance as a percentage of GDP. So you can see that, for the most part, ASEAN countries are in a better situation than OECD countries. And what that also means is that this is your fiscal space in terms of responding to an economic downturn. And that's something that we're very cautious about, because when we look at OECD countries, only now, 10 years later, are they going back to the situation. Going back. 10, So it's only 10 years later that OECD countries are coming back to a fiscal balance that they had prior to the last global crisis, and yet their debt situation is much worse. So the ability to be able to respond to another crisis has been weakened. So this is something that, from a Ministry of Finance point of view, but also in terms of understanding what resources you have to continue delivering services in an economic downturn, it's very important that you are able to keep that in mind to think about your medium-term future. So we've talked about how to achieve citizen centricity. And I think a very important point, which we've been debating a lot ever since we presented this report for the first time in Singapore in October, is that when we look at the international polling data, it shows that citizens in Southeast Asia are actually report being more satisfied with public services than in OECD countries. So some people are saying, oh, that can't be right. You can't say that because we know that we need to improve. But the data is the data. So we want to show it to you, and then we try to understand how to interpret that in the Southeast Asian context. So actually, it reminds me of a story that I want to share with all of you. The person who cuts my hair he's Cambodian Vietnamese in Paris, okay? And one day he said to me, Edwin, it's the people who do not complain who are the ones you have to worry about. Because when they don't complain, the next day, maybe they don't show up again. But the people who complain, they say, oh, it's not right, do it like this, and I want you to fix it, and it's not good enough. Those people, if you respond to their needs, they will become your loyal customers, and they will come back over and over again. I think there's some truth in that what we are looking for is not a relationship where our citizens don't complain. We want a relationship where citizens feel that they can tell us the truth so that we can improve and build up that trust. And they don't always say it in those words. As Asians, we understand, people don't always complain. They don't always say what they don't like. But sometimes they vote with their feet. So we want to create a situation where we can build that level of trust. I think that's ultimately what we're trying to achieve. How do we do that? I think Shinwei has spoken very well about the importance of digitization in terms of providing services that citizens can enjoy from the comfort of their own home. Part of that, and this is a very simple way of thinking about it, but when you think about integrated service delivery, when you look at the voyage of digitization in OECD countries, it was let 1,000 flowers bloom. Every government department wanted to create their own website. And over time, no one could find anything anymore because there were so many different websites. So now we're looking at, do you have an integrated service delivery portal which brings all of those services together so the citizen can go to one place and be able to access what it is that he or she needs? Of course, citizen centricity is much more sophisticated than this, but this is one indicator that lets you think, at least is there a single place where people can direct themselves to these services? Then we also think about something like electronic identification. Just about every country in ASEAN has EID, but have they integrated that with their national online portal? One of the biggest barriers to accessing electronic services is your electronic identification because of the complexity of it. And this is often the point where people drop out of using an online service because it's just too complicated or they can't master it. I've had this problem trying to file my taxes. I couldn't do it, so finally I just do it the old-fashioned way. It's not that the channel wasn't available, but it was the ease of use. So to what extent is this EID being seamlessly integrated with your online service delivery channel in order to make it as simple as possible for citizens to use online authentication to complete services, not just to find them, but to be able to submit them. Then, second aspect is the openness, engagement, and transparency. We're talking about openness not just as a good in and of itself. We're also thinking about how openness can support the government's objectives of improving service delivery. So here are just a few examples that we've seen across OECD countries where we look at open policy making in Costa Rica, where citizens are invited to participate in not just voting for regulations or for resolutions, but they are also invited to take part in the design of those policies. We have an example from Brazil in terms of citizens co-producing new solutions. This is where they actually ask women and mothers in neighborhoods to participate in reporting cases of delinquency and violence. So they use them because they care about their neighborhoods as part of the government's response to civil or domestic problems in neighborhoods. And then a third example is the crowd collaborating platform. I think this example comes from Canada, where the government presents its problems to the broader community, and then they see what types of solutions come up, and they find oftentimes that there are very innovative solutions that government civil servants themselves cannot come up with. So here are ways in which we're using openness not just to be more accountable, but actually to get things done. And I think that is very important to keep in mind, that this is not just about human rights or civil rights, but about how do we be more effective. We see that only half of the countries in ASEAN release information on fiscal projections. So this is where when you make the estimates that say how much money is going to be available for spending in the next year, it's based on a set of assumptions. And in OECD countries, what we found is that when we give that decision-making process to an independent fiscal institution that's outside of government, in fact, the accuracy of those fiscal projections becomes much more accurate. We make fewer mistakes, and that causes government to spend more responsibly within its actual availability of funds. And so not only is it important to get those estimates right, but it's important to be able to share them, because then you can get the criticism and you can get the feedback, which oftentimes will support getting more accurate projections. Beyond the technical sharing of information, there's also how do we provide information in ways that citizens can understand. So we can see that 8 out of the 10 ASEAN countries provide a citizen's budget. And that means taking the information on planned expenditure and describing it in very simple language terms that citizens can understand. So transparency is more than just about making things available, but it's also about making them accessible. Then the OECD has produced its open, useful, and reusable data index. We call it the R Data Index, which is based on the International Open Data Charter. And it's looking at whether you are making government information, public information available. Is it available? Is it accessible? And are you taking activities or practical steps in order to support the reuse of that data? Because if data is reused, that's the only way in which we can create economic opportunities, that we can improve the level of accountability of the government. So you can see that the red on the left-hand side here is the average for the Southeast Asian countries, whereas the OECD is on the far right. So actually, ASEAN is not so far behind the OECD average, but you can see that there's quite a bit of variation, and that for some of the countries in the region, you're doing even better than the OECD average. And then I think the issue of how do we support our civil servants in making this transition or to this transformation to a more citizen-centric perspective. I talked this morning about having a more representative civil service, and I thought that the Indonesian example was very interesting about making sure that the social cultural literacy was there. And I see within OECD countries, there's a lot of discussion around how can we be more sensitive to the needs of indigenous people, for example. So these are concerns which I think we want to make sure that we have citizen centricity for all of our citizens. Then preparing the public service to address complex problems in the digital age. I think this has become sort of a leitmotif of our conversation today, and this table shows the digital competence, whether or not it's a priority for civil service and employee development, and we see that it still is very low in the list of priorities in ASEAN countries. At least that's how it's reported. And then I mentioned this morning that we feel that the performance assessment, all of the good work that you've done in putting in place vehicles to assess and use performance information in the management of civil servants, that can be used as a way to support greater citizen-centric behavior. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily being done so for the moment. So just a couple of closing thoughts. The citizen needs and expectations, they often do not match government organizational structures. In fact, they tend to be very, very wide apart, sort of as Shinwei showed us very well, even for a country like Singapore. But the indicators that we're looking at in Southeast Asian government at a glance, they can help us to focus the attention on what those outcomes are, what it is that we want to achieve, to identify new approaches, different ways of achieving that by looking at how different countries are working to become more citizen-centric. And this creates learning opportunities that help us to focus on implementation. Of course, we want to focus on the outcome, but we also need some ideas about how we can achieve them. Then creating the conditions for innovation is the best driver for strengthening citizen centricity and organizational performance. So you can see some of the things that we're doing to support greater public sector innovation are also important in order to achieve those outcomes, even if the link is not direct, because it's no longer about government doing things, but government enabling the society and the private sector to do things as well. Openness is the key to tackle cultural and structural barriers. So what we see is that you telling civil servants they need to be more open, that gets you so far. But when the citizens are telling them, and when they're forced to confront the needs of the citizens, that is really going to begin changing the mindset. And that public servants hold the key to improve program performance, user knowledge, process insights, and motivation for change. So it's not that civil servants don't know. They have all of this inside of them. They see it, they experience it. So how do we unlock this knowledge to get them to support the improvement of service delivery? So leadership is needed to keep the focus on people, on both sides of the public service counter, both for the citizens that we're serving, but also to understand the civil servants who need to be partners in making this change. So some possible directions for the future. How are governments responding to digital disruption and change? So we've talked a lot about the incremental changes that we need to, as we become more digitized. But what's going to happen around the corner as we look at blockchain and artificial intelligence and data analysis and surveillance technology and facial recognition, this is really going to radically change the way in which governments act. Do governments have the skills and processes and governance arrangements to make the right infrastructure investment decisions? So this may be outside of some of the work that all of you do, but regularly when we talk with units that are responsible for managing public-private partnership decisions, we just met with the PPP unit in Indonesia, they say the biggest problem is we don't have the skills to make those decisions. And most of the time, we're not making real cost-benefit analysis to decide on what is the right project. So in the end, it is coming back to the qualification and the competencies of the civil service. What fundamental public sector building blocks can strengthen citizen centricity and connectivity in the ASEAN region? Some of our colleagues actually are meeting a few blocks away looking at regulatory reform. They should be part of this conversation as well, because if we want to be more innovative, we also have to think of what are the regulations that are blocking civil servants from being more innovative. We're looking at the budgeting procedures. So I myself am working now with ministries of finance. They are oftentimes extremely resistant to new ways of working. So how do we include them in the conversation? Public procurement, it's exactly the same. I think all of you know this. Civil service and openness. All of these are part of a broader conversation. I know that we have to work within the constraints of our ministerial portfolio and the mandate that we have, but we also have to keep this bigger picture in mind, because if what we want is transformation of all of our civil service, we will have to include all of the different elements. So thank you very much. So we now turn it over to the OPDC.
And the clicker. น้องครับเปลี่ยน Which button is it? This one? The left one? The right one. Okay, thank you very much. He has done such a great job of summarizing what the report says. So I will try to limit my comments on Thai experience with regard to these 7 chapters, which coincidentally match what we are working on. You know, things such as citizen-centric civil service. We've been trying for many years using keywords such as effectiveness. How do we respond to citizen needs? How do we become more flexible in providing public services? Budgeting, public finance, human resource management. These are all issues that Thailand has been working on for many, many years. And I'm sure many countries here have also been working on these issues as well. Citizen-centric service. This is actually the heart of what we are talking about. It's why we're all here. All the other chapters, all the other issues are really how do we achieve this. That's from my perspective. Now, if you read what it says is the right policy and expenditure choices, it sounds simple, but in practice it's not. It's not. Many countries have different mechanisms on how do we make this happen. The World Bank advises us that we stick to public financial management framework. 3 primary objectives: fiscal discipline, allocative efficiency, and operational efficiency. So the link between making the right allocation to the resource envelope you have is a big question. And we are struggling with it. We think we are improving, doing a better job. And we have come up with a bunch of tools with planning schemes on how to link resource availability to actual allocation that would result in tangible results on the ground. And it is work in progress still. And when you talk about the right, moving on to the next subject, if you're talking about the right skills, knowledge, and behaviors, we all agree that those are important. But I also believe that there are several other things that are equally important, if not more so, and that is systems, process, and culture. You can have PhDs in your department if the processes and systems do not allow them to prosper, to innovate, then there is no way to maximize their skills and knowledge. Case in point, when I first joined the government, I was at the Budget Bureau, and they sent us away on things such as net present value, modified internal rate of return, economic return, blah, 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 all the technicalities of it. The underlying assumption of net present value, why is it better than IRR, reinvestment rate, right? Now, you learn all of that, which we already did in graduate school. You go back to the office, the system and process do not allow you to utilize these skills, because budgeting is a political process. So ultimately, it is driven by policy. So what's the point of having skills if systems and processes do not allow you to utilize those skills? I think we all know what I'm talking about, judging from the number of nods. And lastly, they talk about digital infrastructure, online identity. Thailand is also working on that. But one of the biggest problems we have is citizen attitude. Sometimes we have system ready for use, but citizens simply do not trust it. Maybe it's an issue of public trust, but sometimes they prefer, well, not sometimes, oftentimes, they prefer a piece of paper with a stamp and a signature. Somehow it feels more confident than a file saved in a hard drive or cloud somewhere. And that is something we have to overcome. Public finance and economics. This is an issue that I think we've made great progress over the past 3 to 4 years. Since the economic crisis, in 1997, the World Bank, the IMF all told us that one thing that we suffered from was fiscal fragmentation, meaning that there are central agencies in charge of a fiscal activity, budgeting, loan, revolving fund, and so on. And every agency had a law, meaning that the Bureau of the Budget reporting to the Prime Minister is not part of the Finance Ministry. Public Debt Management Office has its own public debt management law, so we don't have to communicate. Revolving fund is at CGD, Comptroller General's Department. So decisions were made in isolation without true integration of the resource envelope that a government has access to. And we've been talking about a fiscal discipline law for over a decade. Finally, it was passed last year. This law requires that the government manages the fiscal activities of a country completely. And by that, I'm talking about direct fiscal activities as well as fiscal risks, such as quasi-fiscal activities, such as asking a government-owned financial institution to implement public policy. These all represent risks to the fiscal position of the country. So we have to include all of these on and off the books items in our medium-term fiscal framework, setting medium-term targets. And these are public information. The public has full access to it. Without going into much detail, this is a great step that we are working on. And finally, we are getting to see the full picture and not just a smaller pieces of fiscal activity. One thing to bear in mind when you look at public debt, the definition differs from country to country. What we classify or what we count as public debt may not be what you count as public debt, because what we count as public debt is defined by law. And that law may not be the same as yours. I'm not sure when you collect information, you account for this difference. Government revenues. I love what you said, okay? Not to follow OECD practice of increasing taxation as percentage of GDP. That's precisely what the World Bank told us to do, because they said to provide citizens with better services, with more inclusive services, more welfare, more social security, you need to increase your tax base as well as tax rate. So the target was set at 35%. We are now under 20. So I tend to, from now on, I will side more with OECD than the World Bank on fiscal issues. Thank you very much. Something interesting in this particular slide, when you talk about general government expenditures, is that Thailand suffers from, I think, overspending on current expenditures. You know, salary, office supplies, utilities. This together accounts for almost 80%, meaning that we have roughly 20%, and in some years even less, for investment, capital expenditure, building roads, schools, airports, ports, and so on. So this is something that we are keeping a very close eye on. How do we increase this fiscal space to enable more investment? Because if you look at all the advice we get is that we need to invest more, socially as well as physically. Socially meaning social security, welfare, schools, hospitals. Economically, you know, airports, highways, trains, and so on. So this is still work in progress, but I think many countries here also share my sentiment. Public employment. This is not an issue I'm an expert at, but the report focuses on women in public service and in politics. 2 years ago, I just looked up, and when he was talking, 65.82% of civil service are actually women. That figure was 2 years ago. 65.82% are women. So I don't think we have a problem with women participation in the civil service in Thailand. The law treats all genders as equal. There are no differences. In fact, I don't think gender is even mentioned. But the 5% figure involved in politics is a bit more interesting. I think sometimes it stems from simple lack of interest. I have many friends who were approached by political parties, inviting them to run. They all said, we have higher moral compass than that. Secondly, I make 50 times what an MP would make as a banker. So I have absolutely no interest to run for office. Why would I? I have no vested interest, family vested interest to protect, and I need to make a good living. So sometimes I think women are more practical in Thailand, and they prefer to make money and have a happy life rather than get down and dirty in the trenches of politics, particularly our version of politics. And women face significant barriers in reaching senior leadership positions. I think Thailand is increasingly overcoming this. All my bosses are women. Okay, and if you look at some of the most important central agencies in Thailand, the number one, the big kahuna is women. The Civil Service Commission is headed by a woman, for example. True equality yet? No, probably not. But making significant progress towards equality, sorry. Now, I can go overboard on this, but I will attempt not to, since I'm a budgeting man like you were in my previous life. Again, the government made a bold decision last year in passing a new Budget Procedures Act. This has been recommended for many, many years, but we never, ever did. This government did it finally. What are some of the key features that I think are good? Firstly, they are placing more emphasis on area-based management. In the past, it was all functional management by departments. So a provincial governor would sit there not knowing who is doing what in his or her province, because it's all driven centrally. Right now, according to this new law, we are now labeling local governments as well as provinces and provincial clusters as budgeting units, so that they are able to request for budget directly for the purposes that they seem fit. So this is a big, bold step. Secondly, we have always been criticized for being highly functional. Again, same problem. And there is very little horizontal integration between different departments. Modern strategic outcomes are not possible without seamless integration across agencies. National competitiveness, how do you achieve that without integration across agencies? Because it involves so many agencies. Drug eradication, again. Tourist promotion, again. So the new budget law allows for what we call an integrated budget, meaning that you can allocate a budget to a strategy. And funding can be transferred across departments in the same strategy. Let's say you have a budget item for national competitiveness. If agency 1 doesn't perform, you have the flexibility to transfer to agency 2 and have them do something else that contributes. That contributes to national competitiveness. I think we are talking too much. Okay. Thirdly, what they are doing is emphasizing monitoring and evaluation. Before, it was always an excuse. By the time that the result of program evaluation is available, it's already 3-4 years down the road, and it has no bearing on current year budget allocation. So we are trying to change that. At least monitoring can be done. Price, quantity, timeliness, cost, quality. These 4 indicators, which could be used to influence budget allocation. In most cases, you cannot punish the departments, because doing so ultimately punishes the citizens. If schools are not doing well and you say, I'm going to cut your budget because you're not doing well, who suffers? Students. So these indicators are used to drive budget allocation as well as a way to improve service delivery for better outcome. I can go on, but I think this is, one more thing that I think is important. Budget information. all budget documents are available for download online, but statistics show that nobody bothers. Citizens have access to the same documents that we submit to Parliament before submission, as well as the corrected version after. Nobody cares. So this is something we have to work on. The information is available. People are not interested. Our Public Debt Management Office has an application that you could go on App Store, PDMO. Public Debt Management stands for PDMO stands for Public Debt Management Office. And it has an app where you can look at public debt as percentage of GDP, what the debt is actually used to finance. Again, the number of downloads are insignificant. People simply do not care. And their debate during our last election that the country is in great debt, but nobody bothers to verify the truth. So just because the information is there doesn't mean that the citizens would take advantage of available information. So this is something that I think we have to keep in mind. Maybe it's too difficult to understand. Maybe we need to come up with a citizen budget. I think someone talked about that. But we also have our own version called Budget in Brief, which is fairly simple. I mean, you can see what budget allocations are made for, organization as well as strategy, as well as other dimensions, because you can classify, you can dissect the budget in many different ways. Human resource management. Again, I think I won't talk too much about this because we all know the importance of having the right skills, soft skills as well as hard skills. We know the importance of performance management, which I think has to include cultural differences as well. So the way we evaluate in Thailand might have no bearing at all in how you evaluate in Indonesia. Or the highly evolved Singaporean model might not be applicable to our context. And I think we have to focus a lot more on things such as corporate culture. You have bright students coming in, joining the civil service, and he or she is often hammered by the very restrictive, ancient culture of that organization. This is the way you do things. And if you stick up, you become a nail that you get hammered down. So human resource management has to also look at systems and processes and corporate culture to allow people to prosper, to innovate. And lastly, that I would like to talk about this issue is it's highlighted here. My staff said, Philippines and Thailand attracting qualified professionals is a big challenge. Wow. It's true. I think there are three things facing particularly Thailand. Firstly, we all know that Generation Y, they need instant gratification. Okay, they have very little patience. They want to achieve making big bucks very quickly, very easily. Joining the government ain't it. It's not going to make you big bucks, okay? Secondly, they perceive it as being old-fashioned, which is true. But if you bear with it, you can do some good for your country. The pay is very low. If you compare the pay scale to the private sector, it's not even worth making the comparison. You just have to keep your head down and accept it if you want to work for the government. So I think it is a big challenge for us to attract and retain. Some agencies are very good at attracting, like Bank of Thailand. They come back from Harvard, from MIT. After they pay off their student loan, they're all gone. They leave for the private sector. So this is a big problem. You can attract, but you cannot retain. Another big challenge is we have aging society. When ASEAN population peaks in a couple of decades, Thailand population will decline from 65 million today to 40 million. So there is no way that we have smaller and smaller pool of talent to recruit from, and that is a big challenge. Digital and open government. How am I doing on time?
You're still on time.
I am? Okay. Digital and open government. The way we look at digital government is fairly complex. Digital government has to help us on several levels. Firstly, it has to help us to manage our agencies better. It must help us to plan better, such as using big data, such as forcing agencies to share information. Department of Labor wants information on university graduates, but they can't get it from Ministry of Education because they won't share information. So how can you make a good plan, a good strategy, if you don't have access to the information that you need? You have to be able to help manage day-to-day operation. Sometimes we have e-office, but it becomes a burden rather than a tool. You have to do it on paper, then you have to go into the system and log, okay, document received, status processing, and then you do whatever you do, and then you send it out, you got to log on again, and okay, the document sent. So it doesn't really help. Secondly, thirdly, the system in helping us manage, it has to provide a good channel, an effective channel for citizen participation. We talk about responding to their needs, but how do we hear them? And having just an email address or an inbox that people send their comments in and we don't respond to, that doesn't count. So the system really has to help us, plus our working processes. We have to truly incorporate the inputs into our planning and our M&E effort. Second big thing is the system has to be effective in providing online services. So it has to help us manage and it has to improve services for citizens. Right now we have a plan to implement what we call Doing Business Portal as advised by the World Bank. It will put 300 licenses online. It's work in progress, so I don't want to boast too much about it, but it is something we are working on. It's projected to cost around 4 billion baht. But that's on the business side. Parallel to that effort, we are also planning to implement a citizen portal to help them with day-to-day mundane stuff that you need to deal with the government on. Hopefully it would prevent them from having to travel from the luxury of your home to an office that is 5 kilometers away but takes 2 hours to get to. Digital ID is also work in progress. We have already set up, not by we, it's the Thai private sector, have already invested and set up a system for national digital ID. Law has been passed, awaiting royal consent, that would enable this to be implemented. So we are working on many issues all at once. But I think a very important obstacle to digital and open government is not. Digital government has one big obstacle. Open government is the government doing its thing. Digital government, citizens has to, the people have to accept it and have to utilize it, have to know their rights and get on board. If we have all these, wonderful services online, but people don't care for it, then I think we have failed. That's one lesson that we have. Serving citizen. I think I won't talk too much about that, except for the fact that I agree with your sentiment. How could that be? How could this be? How could we be satisfied with healthcare and education when our PISA score is so embarrassing? Access to education is not the same as quality. So I think I will just stop there on that particular issue. To be effective, I think that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
And our last speaker is Ibu Erna.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I think you are tired, I know. I know. So I will not consume much of your time. When the organizer asked me you have to do commenting for the publication, and then I think, what should I comment? So the finding is already there. So I will put a context in here because it's very interesting when Edwin said that one of the objectives is comparing. Do we do the comparing or not? Because I agree with you that sometimes we talking different meaning if we compare one country to another. So I will give context if we're talking about Indonesia. This is about Indonesia. We're talking especially that we have 250 million populations. This is very, very big, I'm sure. And also, we have more than 17,000 islands. And there are a lot of dialect and culture involved. So when in this morning, Pak Adi Junjungan told about the centralized and government official management, because one of the government official management purposes is to guarantee the unity of the diversity. That's why we use the centralized recently. And this is all that's contact, I think, influence all the policy that have been adopted in Indonesia right now. So I will present here is our Indonesia long-term development planning system that will end it in 2025. Mr. Adi this morning also quote this one, that we want to have a strong economic structure, also competition, advantages among the region, and also the qualified human resource. This is very important for us if we want to achieve this long-term goal. I will start my presentation for Indonesia using from the point of view of the citizen right now in Indonesia. We have a very, very big changes in terms of communication and technology, even for the citizens. Right now, we have more than 143 million population using the internet right now. And also, from that one, there are a big increasing in terms of the internet user growing until 2017. And in terms of ages, we can see here that these ages from 18 under 34 years is the most population who use the internet. So this population is very mature and also productive ages. So this is very important for us as the government official, how we will manage this kind of situation. So this is the implication. The first one is the stakeholder involvement is increased. This means that this can drive to innovative government and also monitor the government conduct. For example, it's very easy for the community to protest about something and make it viral. And it's very, very easy. You can find it in Indonesia right now if we're talking about the political situation right now, because next 2 weeks we have a presidential election. There are a lot of viral Twitter or Instagram or something like that. Then we cannot stop this one. So it's very easy for the population, for example, to protest or critique the government. This is the first one, that this can drive the government to be innovative. And the second one is the independent citizen. The creative society, easy to learn and empower society. This is very true in Indonesia, because if we see about the Industrial Revolution 4.0, we're talking about marketplace or something like that. There are a lot of new technology introduced and adopted by the society. They become the independent society. And also the third one is the easy communication and also collaboration from the government to the citizen, and also from the citizen to the government and among other stakeholders, whether this is private or government to government. I will not talking about each chapter like you did before. That's very, very good. And also I won't talking about the finance also, because it's far from my expertise, so maybe I'm wrong. So I only talking about the two things. The first one is the citizen-centric and satisfaction. The first one, innovation and internet-based service in central and local government. This morning, Elke already told us about the innovation lab in Indonesia. Actually, the number is bigger than that one. Yeah, we have Ministry of Home Affairs, we have NIPA, National Institute of Public Administration, my office, and also we have Ministry of Bureaucratic Reform. Three of us develop a system of innovation. And the number, I think, is thousands of innovation right now creating in Indonesia. And the problem is, how we faster this process, even though we already has this big number of innovation, because we have more than 17,000 islands, we have 34 provinces, and more than 540 something local governments. So sometimes we suggest they do not need to create the new one. The imitation, but put it in the context in their own local government, is faster, fastest the process. Because if the lab, innovation lab, meaning that they have to create the new one, I think it takes time and not effectively used by the local government, because we have a very far-reach comparison between one local government to another. That's why imitation, adaptive, or something like that in terms of innovation is very successfully adopted in Indonesia. And also, for the local government or government official who has conducted it very advanced in terms of innovation, I think they do a lot of things. For example, in West Java, for example, the government services, they put it in the private marketplace. They do not create it by themselves because it's useless. This is something like that, because everybody right now using the marketplace. Why don't we go to the marketplace and put it there so easier for the citizen to make their business or something like that. And also, right now, like you mentioned before, also in Thailand, that the tendency in Indonesia right now is developed integrated service delivery, like service mall and one-stop service become mature strategy right now in Indonesia. Even the OSS, online single submission licensing system, launched in 2018, right now is mandatory for the local government to integrate this one into the one system. And also basis services such as education and health are the priority to be addressed in many activities. This is the vital basic services in Indonesia, and the situation is different from one local government to another, but this basic services is warranted by the national policy, so this is a basic need that to be prioritized by the local government. In terms of the revolution industry 4.0, we also has like 10 strategy for Indonesia industry 4.0. It's covering 10 strategy that has been adopted by many ministries in Indonesia. And I move to talking about the transforming about open government in Indonesia right now. It started in 2012, it's a long time ago, but we still have problem, of course. This is not easy thing to do, the transfer open government partnership, but we do making some agenda about this one. The first one is making government data open through the regulation, because at first, sometimes we thought that mandatory is easiest thing to do. So that's what we did at the beginning when we tried to use this open data, and also train the government official in terms of the making government data open, and also develop some technology to support this one. The second one, we still have problem with this one, but we try to resolve this one, is mutual and strong collaboration among government agency. Sometimes silo in terms of government agency still happen, but we do many things to limit this constraint. For example, from my office, I'm from National Institute of Public Administration. We're dealing with government official training program, whether this is leadership training program or technical training program. We do have a training program called, this is from reforming the government official in a middle level. We have like thematic agenda dealing with this one. For example, last year we are dealing with the disaster management because we have many problems in dealing with disaster. Even the Vice President said that when the disaster happened, where is the government? Because the military is the one who came to the disaster area, not the government. The government is not there. And then last year we have a specific class dealing with this one. All the participants is coming from the ministries related to this agenda. So it's like thematic, sometimes nuclear, sometimes the disaster management, license or something like this, like a thematic agenda to do this one. And also dealing with the private sector or business and using the open data government. Sometimes it's very, very difficult. The private sector sometimes complaining that it's not easy for them to access the data for the government, but actually I agree with you, but because we have regulation saying that what type of data or information can be open to the public, and which one to be, I don't know, is it secret or something like that? I don't know what we call for this one, but yes, it's happened. But right now we try to give more space for the private sector to use the data for more efficient and also effectively in terms of system. Public employment and government capacity. My colleague this morning already talked a lot about the government official, but in terms of number of the civil service, it's relatively small compared to our population. Even though we have more than 400.3 million government official, you said that that is the number of the population, and maybe, I don't know in Singapore how much the population. 4 millions, yeah, so the number is, our government official is the same, almost the same as Singaporean population, but in terms of comparison about the government official to the population is still small in Indonesia. And also if we're talking about the demographical aspect, we will say that it's very, very small, the government official in Indonesia. But in 2014, but implemented in 2018, this year, we introduced the formal contractual basis for civil service. It started this year. This is not the easiest thing to do, Pak Adi know very well, because at the beginning, we want to recruit the talented person to join the government official as part of the civil servant. But we have a lot of issue about this one. For example, we have homework from the previous system about the honorarium employee. It's look like a contractual, but most of the recruitment is questionable. For example, because this is like nepotism is there during the previous time. As the number is more than 4,000 people. 400,000 people in Indonesia. And this 400,000 person is asking to become the civil servants. So the government say that, oh, we do not have that kind of arrangement for the government official. So we have a lot of difficulties in applying this one, the contractual basis for civil servant. But this year we try to have, how many, Pak Adi? Almost 200? The number?
The first stage is about 2,700.
2,700 for the teacher, lecturer, and then medical staff, and also for the agriculture profession. So only for these three professions. And also, we set up the national standard to boost the civil service competency. World-class bureaucracy, world-class government is our ultimate target. So this is very, very interesting for us, like you mentioned before, that if we're talking about the world-class bureaucracy or world-class government, we're talking about competency. And there should be competency like technology, coping with the technology, language, and also technical thing. But your findings say that there is limited, only few countries adopted this IT or technology in their strategy. So we try to solve this one also in Indonesia. For example, there are three main agencies responsible for this human resource management. We're talking about the Ministry for Manpower, Ministry of Education, Higher Education, and Ministry of Basic Education. For the Ministry of Higher Education, there is curriculum saying that the student has to do this one in terms of the technology. In terms of Ministry of the Basic Education, it's very, very difficult to find the stated curriculum saying about this technology. If we're talking about the Ministry of Manpower, they will say that we have specific agenda for this one. They do it by themselves. They do not do it together. So we try right now to do this one as a mutual coordination between these three ministries. Okay, the last one is our responsibility. My agency is responsible for this one, is to strengthen the capacities of the civil service. Right now we try to introduce many agenda in developing the non-conventional of learning system for the government or government official. Distant learning, e-learning, blended learning, mentoring, coaching, working, and then many things we develop this one to support the capacity of the government official. Also, we have a formal hour of training per person of the government official, and the number is not too big compared to Singapore. I think Singapore has more than 100 hours per person per year, more than that one. We only have 20 hours per person per year. So, but this is new. This is big for us because the number is different, because we're thinking a lot of things, even though we stated that before we're thinking about 88 hours. And then we considering a lot of things, the system, the budget, something like 44 hours. And then at the end, 20 hours. So this is very interesting, but this is a starting point for us to say that developing the government official is very important. Women participation. We must proud for this one, because ministerial position will increase significantly right now. I think we are very proud for this one, even though the number of women in the government official, I think it's around 40 or something, but still the number is quite good for me. So this is very interesting, and right now we are trying to promoting, supporting environment for women participating in public sector. For example, we provide many infrastructure needed by the women when they are working, And also, this is the last one is very, very interesting right now. We're talking about the flexible working hours, but this is not only for the women, because many women will say that this is not fair. This is for everybody. Flexible working hour, in talk recently, how we can arrange like a very, very flexible mode of working hour for the government employee. There are many, many modes. We already implemented, but in a small scale and very, very limited modes, but we talk to larger this modes. This is very, very interesting recently. What next? I think that's the most important thing after this publication, because we already has everything presented in the publication. Many data is not there. I know, because Edwin and team all choose the relevant one, or I don't know, this is the safe one or not, but many data actually there. So what next? What it means for Indonesia? We did something. We already did something. We achieved something. We are here. This is the basic line. So I do not really agree with comparing. For me, Indonesia, because this is the first time, and also for the ASEAN, I think this is the first time, this is the basic line for us. This is where we are right now. This is not a matter of mine is better than yours and yours is better than mine. It's not there. This is the basic line. From this one, from this line, what is the progress? For example, 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years after this one. How many percentage changes happening during this, after the 2 years of today or last year? I think that's the most important thing. What we learn from the process is we can use many data in the publication for providing reliable information for evidence in government practices, policy making, and also regulatory reform. I think many information is there. There is evidence. And the evidence is valid because there are methods there and scientifically tested. I think this is period, the evidence. And also, this is independent sources for triggering better development planning system. This is the independent one, even though the data is compiling for the government or government offices, but this is, the information is independent. And also accelerate Indonesia's Sustainable Development Goal achievement. What we can do from this publication, the first one is improving policy making in 6 areas of government at a glance. The indicator is internationally recognized. I think this is very, very good opportunity for us. If we want to make better our policy making process, we can start from this indicator. Capacity development for policy maker, managing resources for maintaining areas government at the glance effectively, and the last one, and reinforcing role of policy analysis in public sector. You mentioned before, Edwin, when you talking in Indonesia, that in producing policy and government, the evidence sometimes or more often is not there. Cost-benefit analysis is not easy thing. I already practice, it's not easy thing. But we do need this one. We do need that policy making is evidence-based in policy making. We try to have policy analysis in Indonesia since 2015. The number is increased right now. I think this is a good opportunity for them to use this publication as evidence when they create the policy making in Indonesia. I think there are a lot of things we can learn from the publication, but put in mind, this is not comparison. This is not comparison. This is ours. We have differences, we have progress, we have 2 more years. This is our basic line for 2017. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Erna. I think that your point that the toughest comparison we have is with ourselves. That's a good one. That's a good one, and one for us to keep in mind. People have been listening very patiently all day, and I want to give an opportunity for just one or two questions from the audience. If anyone has any questions, either to this panel or to the previous panel. We've covered a lot. This was a very challenging session. But does anyone have any comments or questions? We are so complete. Oh, please, go ahead. Can we...
Thank you. I would like to ask for Indonesian case, how about your country that have far away islands a lot, and how you do participation, and how you can done the policy of the government. How can you do that to centralize? Thank you.
We do centralize the human government official management, but in terms of managing the local government, we do this decentralization. For example, if we're talking about the public service delivery, we set up the national standard. This is the national standard, but the local government can adjust it to their context. In terms of, we have like, we categorize our local government in many reasons. Ministry of Home Affairs, like which local government is very advanced, which one is the middle one, and which one is a little bit under the national standard, something like that. This influence the central government policy in terms of, for example, financial support or something like that. But in terms of service delivery, each local government make their own policy, make their own decision making in terms of public service delivery. But there is national standard. To achieve this national standard, there are big support from the lowest local government compared to the highest one. Even when we have discussion last month, when I'm talking about the policy analysis, we try to create many more policy analysis in central and local government. Many agencies say that don't put the senior policy analysis in the local government, in the district level, put it in the provincial level. And we say that no, the problem is different. The problem is different. Even the local government and the district level need the senior policy analysis, not only in the provincial government. So this is like each local government has their own problems. They should come up with their own solution for this one. But the national government guarantee that the national standard is achieved. So the centralized meaning is only for the government official. We have centralized system because before, like Pak Edi mentioned this morning, when we try to decentralize the management of government official, what happened is nepotism. Because in local government, the politics is very, very strong. For example, the government or the mayor being appointed, and then they replace all of the senior official in their office. And when they become to the office, they will bring their relative, their friend, their colleague into the service. Something like that. That's why in terms of government official, we try to centralize, to make it open to public using the technology, using the accountability or something like that. But in terms of public service delivery, they have their own solution for them. Thank you.
So I'm going to wrap up the session now. I just want to, tomorrow we're going to continue discussing the data in government at a glance with regard to the digital government and open government, but we'll also be talking about how a qualitative study and following a country into greater detail is a way of understanding better what the findings are in the report, and then to respond to Ibu Erna's comment about, what do we do with this? I think that we are ready to have workshops, diffusion, bring together sort of groups within your country? Because right now we have 1 or 2 of you from each country. You benefit, but how can we use this to feed a discussion more broadly within your government? So that's something you can think about. The other thing is now this report is finalized. We've received comments from all of you, approval from all of you. That means that we will be ready to launch it in the next few months. So if you can go back to your capitals, mention perhaps whether or not your director generals or your ministers would be interested in participating in an event to launch this report, where we're thinking maybe July, if that is possible. Whether you'd be interested, please let us know. Please give us your feedback. And then finally, if we have this event to launch this on social media, to get the word out, we will have at that time a steering group meeting to talk about what the next themes will be, whether it's a continuation of these same surveys, but it may be 2 years is too short. Maybe we need to wait 4 years to see what the progress is. So if that is the case, then what would be the topics that are where you really are looking for evidence to support your decision making at home? These are the insights that we need from all of you in order for us to think about the next version of Southeast Asia Government at a Glance. Thank you very much.